Marcus Ellison had walked the halls of the Richmond courthouse dozens of times before. At 39, he was no stranger to its polished marble floors, the musty scent of aged law books, or the weight of history that pressed down from the vaulted ceilings. He tried his share of tough cases, weathered hostile cross-examinations, and stood before judges who barely glanced his way. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what happened that morning. What started as a routine hearing would erupt into a public spectacle and plunge him into a war he never asked for, but one that would define the rest of his life. The courthouse itself was like an old southern fortress, worn oak benches, peeling paint in corners no one noticed, and light fixtures that flickered no matter how often they were replaced. But Marcus moved through it with purpose. His dark leather shoes tapped confidently against the stone floors. He wore a navy blue tie, sharply knotted, and carried his well-worn brown briefcase like a soldier clutching his shield. Today he was defending Jamal Carter, a 22-year-old black mechanic accused of stealing a car. Except Jamal hadn't stolen anything. He'd bought that car with his own money, every last dollar earned fixing transmissions and brake lines in a gritty garage on the east side of town. The evidence against Jamal was paper-thin. A grainy surveillance video showed a shadowy figure in a hoodie, but no license plate, no clear facial features, nothing you could hang a conviction on. The only witness was a nervous gas station attendant who claimed to have seen Jamal near the scene. Despite it being nearly midnight and poorly lit, Marcus had seen this before, too many times. Cases where young black men were treated more like suspects than citizens. But even with that bitter familiarity, this one felt different. It wasn't just the case that made his stomach tighten, it was the judge, Evelyn Carver. Carver had ruled courtroom 3B for over 30 years. She was 62, a white woman with silver hair tied into a bun, so tight it looked like it hurt. Her black robe fell heavy over her thin frame, and her eyes, hazel and cold, pierced through attorneys like they were bugs under glass. Her reputation wasn't whispered about in academic circles or legal reviews. It traveled in side glances and low murmurs in the courthouse cafeteria. "If you're black and in her courtroom," one older defense lawyer once told Marcus, "you better bring armor." Marcus had always known how to play it straight. Never raise your voice, never take the bait, never let them see you sweat. But the moment he entered her courtroom that day, he felt it. The disdain, sharp and immediate, practically oozing from her expression as she looked at him like a stain on the floor. "Mr. Ellison," she said, her voice like silk wrapped around steel, "don't bore me with your sob stories today. I've got a full docket, and I'd rather not waste my morning." Her words hit like a slap. A murmur ran through the gallery. Marcus kept his face still, jaw tight, and nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." He took his place beside Jamal, who sat in a pressed but clearly borrowed suit, his large hands folded so tightly they turned pale at the knuckles. Marcus leaned down, whispered, "We've got this." Jamal nodded, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and trust. Then it began. The prosecutor, a young white man named Hargrove, with a cheap suit and cheaper theatrics, spun a tale of a repeat offender. Despite Jamal having no criminal record, he painted the young man as a menace, a threat, a thug in overalls. Marcus listened, jotting notes, the corners of his legal pad curling from the pressure of his pen. When his turn came, he stood and faced the jury. A dozen faces, mostly white, some indifferent, some skeptical. "This case isn't about facts," he said evenly. "It's about assumptions. My client didn't steal a car. He paid for it, fair and square. What the state has is a blurry video and a shaky witness. What we have is the truth." For a moment, a spark. A woman in the back row raised her eyebrows. A man with a gray beard tilted his head, listening. It wasn't much, but Marcus knew the value of momentum. But Carver wasn't having it. She cut off his cross-examinations, overruled valid objections, sustained flimsy ones from Hargrove. When a defense witness, Jamal's boss, a gravel-voiced mechanic, testified that he saw Jamal buy the car, she sneered, "Your word's as good as nothing." Marcus had been insulted before. He'd been dismissed, ignored, doubted, but this was venom. Direct, targeted. He didn't flinch, but the jury felt it. The room shifted, the cold power of a biased bench hanging heavy over the truth. And then, just as the trial seemed doomed to a familiar injustice, everything exploded. 7 minutes into her ruling, Judge Evelyn Carver declared Jamal guilty. "Because I say so," she snapped, slamming her gavel. The words hadn't even finished echoing through the chamber when 2 federal agents burst into the courtroom. "Judge Carver," one announced, flashing a badge, "you're under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, and civil rights violations." Gasps, chaos, cameras, Carver frozen in disbelief. But even as the cuffs clicked around her wrists and agents led her away, she turned to Marcus with eyes full of hate. "You'll pay for this," she hissed. And Marcus knew this was no longer just a case, it was war. Marcus Ellison had always believed that the courtroom was sacred ground, a place where truth was supposed to reign, and justice would rise, no matter who stood accused. That belief had been battered over the years, dulled by countless cases where bias disguised itself in procedure, and where judges, like Evelyn Carver, wielded the law not as a tool of fairness, but as a weapon of control. But on that humid Virginia morning, as Marcus adjusted his navy blue tie in the hallway mirror of the Richmond courthouse, he didn't know he was about to make history. He had walked into courtroom 3B with the quiet focus of a man prepared for battle. He wasn't just defending a client, he was defending an ideal. His client, Jamal Carter, was a young black mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold. He had saved for months to buy an old car, only to be arrested 2 weeks later and accused of stealing the very vehicle he had paid for. The evidence? A blurry surveillance tape and a jittery gas station attendant who claimed, without seeing a face, that it was Jamal. Marcus had taken cases like this before. He knew the game, thin evidence padded with racial assumptions, but this time was different. The judge presiding over this trial wasn't just biased, she was infamous. Judge Evelyn Carver had sat on the Richmond bench for over 30 years. Her rulings had carved a legacy of lopsided justice, especially when the defendants were black. Her name wasn't revered in legal circles, it was whispered about over bitter coffee in courthouse cafeterias. Her glare was legend, her contempt palpable. The trial began as expected, with Carver wielding her gavel like a cudgel. She dismissed Marcus's objections without a second glance, and upheld every flimsy claim the prosecutor offered. But Marcus pressed forward. He wasn't there for her approval, he was there to defend Jamal. When the state produced a police report claiming the car was stolen, Marcus pounced. The report's chain of custody was broken, and he had the officer's deposition to prove it. When that was overruled, he countered with notarized documents of Jamal's purchase. A ripple moved through the jury, doubt creeping in. Marcus then called Jamal's boss, a gruff mechanic named Ray Torres, to testify that Jamal had paid for the car in cash. The jury leaned in, intrigued, but Carver struck like lightning, undermining the testimony with a sneer. "Then your word's as good as nothing," she spat. And yet, Marcus didn't fold. He called his final witness, Paul Grayson, the white owner of the shop where Jamal had bought the vehicle. Paul's memory was clear, his tone steady. "That boy paid me $2,000 and drove off with a smile," he said. That struck a nerve. But it was Carver's reaction that would go viral before day's end. "I don't trust your memory," she said with a smirk. Then turning toward the jury, "And Marcus," she added coldly, "nor do I trust his kind to tell the truth about anything." The courtroom gasped. Her racism, usually veiled in formality, had come unfiltered, raw and chilling. Marcus stood, his voice steel. "Your Honor, I request a sidebar." "That statement demands a response." Carver's hazel eyes burned. "Denied," she hissed. "Sit down, Mr. Ellison, or I'll have you removed." That moment, a black lawyer, confronting a white judge's open bigotry, would be replayed on every national news network within hours. But what followed stunned even Marcus. 7 minutes after that exchange, the double courtroom doors swung open. 2 federal agents entered, their suits sharp, their expressions hard. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, held up a folded document and barked, "Judge Evelyn Carver, step down. You are under arrest." The courtroom erupted, reporters leaping from their seats, jurors gasping, cell phones raised to record the moment. Carver's face twisted into disbelief as the agents approached. Her fingers clung to the edge of her bench, her voice cracking. "What is the meaning of this? You're charged with bribery, abuse of power, and civil rights violations." The second agent replied calmly, as her hands were cuffed behind her back. Carver's face drained of color, but before she was led away, she turned toward Marcus. Her eyes narrowed to slits, her lips barely moved. "You'll pay, Ellison," she whispered. A chill ran down his spine. The courtroom went silent as the door slammed shut behind her. It was over, or so it seemed. Marcus didn't celebrate immediately. He sat, his breath shallow, as reporters rushed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones jabbed. He waved them off, needing time to think. He had spent months feeding quiet tips to the FBI, whispers about Carver's dealings, the real estate tycoons she favored, the cops she protected. But he had never expected it to explode during Jamal's trial. Outside, a crowd gathered. Some clapped, some cheered, others cried. Jamal, free at last, embraced Marcus with tears in his eyes. "You did it," he said. That night, they met at Maggie's Diner, a squat brick building with flickering neon lights. Jamal, now dressed in a red hoodie instead of a jumpsuit, slid a basket of fries across the table. "Man, you're a legend," he said, grinning. Marcus chuckled, "Just doing my job." But inside, he felt the victory settling like ash. Carver's glare, her final words, haunted him. This wasn't just a courtroom win. It was a declaration of war. Back at his apartment, a modest third-floor walk-up, he poured himself a glass of bourbon and sank onto his worn couch. The radio buzzed with updates. "Judge Carver, arrested mid-trial today, faces federal charges." He turned the volume up, letting the words wash over him like balm. But even with her gone, something lingered. He glanced out the window at the Richmond skyline, now tinged orange with sunset. A single question echoed in his mind. If Carver had ruled for 30 years with impunity, how deep did her roots go? The answer would come sooner than he wanted. But for now, Marcus Ellison had won. He had saved Jamal. He had unseated a tyrant in her own courtroom. And he had done it with truth, grit, and the unshakable belief that justice, no matter how buried, could still rise. Marcus Ellison hadn't slept. His apartment reeked of ash, not just from the fire that destroyed his office, but from the metaphorical kind, the kind that clung to your skin when a part of your life was reduced to rubble. Just hours ago, he was the face of triumph, the man who brought down a tyrant judge. Now, his law firm was a burnt skeleton, and a brick had nearly shattered his car window. He held the latest threat in his hands. "No lawyer, you're next," scrawled in jagged red ink on a scrap of paper taped to a brick. The message wasn't subtle. The hatred was personalized, raw, and unmistakable. Outside, Richmond's morning light seeped through cracked blinds, too soft for the war brewing around him. His phone buzzed constantly, reporters, allies, friends checking in, offering support, some scared silent. Lena, his paralegal, had barely slept either. Her text read, "You okay?" Cops were outside my place last night. Same buzz-cut white officer. The same sneer, the same smirk that had dismissed his cries for help when his office was in flames. Marcus's jaw clenched. It wasn't paranoia, it was a pattern. Evelyn Carver may have been cuffed, but her network was still alive, wriggling like a nest of snakes, disturbed but not destroyed. Her arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of battle, one fought in shadows, whispers, and threats written in red ink. By noon, he'd filed a report about the second brick. The officer behind the desk had all the urgency of someone taking a lunch order. When Marcus handed him the evidence, the cop barely looked at it. Could be kids, he mumbled, tossing the note aside like a grocery receipt. Kids don't know Evelyn Carver, Marcus said coldly, but it didn't matter. The cop was already looking past him. Back at his apartment, Marcus sat in silence. The city outside pulsed with life, car horns, sirens, distant shouts, but his world had narrowed to a single thought. They know where I live, they know where my sister lives, and they're not finished. The knock at his door came just before dusk. It wasn't loud, just 3 precise taps. Marcus's heart thudded as he approached. Through the peephole he saw no one. But when he opened the door, a package lay at his feet. No return address. Inside, a charred photo of his law school graduation, the frame twisted from heat. The message on the back, Justice Burns. He closed the door slowly, locking both bolts, then sat with his back against it, the photo trembling in his hands. Across town, his sister Tanya was staying with a friend, the kids tucked into sleeping bags and trying to pretend their home hadn't been firebombed. Marcus had checked in earlier, his voice steady even as guilt gnawed at him. "This isn't your fault," Tanya had whispered. "This is who she is." "But now they're coming for you too," Marcus replied, his voice low. Later that night, Lena called. "They've filed a complaint with the bar," she said, anonymous. "But I checked the metadata. It came from a clerk who used to work under Carver." Marcus exhaled, the weight in his chest pressing deeper. "What's the claim? Unethical conduct, fabrication of evidence, retaliatory prosecution. In there trying to disbar me." Lena didn't answer. 3 days later, the Virginia Bar Association hearing wasn't held in a courtroom, but in a drab conference room on the 3rd floor of an old colonial-style building in downtown Richmond. 3 men sat behind a long oak table, their ties perfectly knotted, their expressions unreadable. The lead, a balding man named Pritchard, peered over wire-framed glasses like a disappointed grandfather. "Mr. Ellison," he began, "we've received multiple complaints regarding your conduct during the proceedings of Judge Evelyn Carver's case. Allegations of coercion, falsified documents, and inappropriate courtroom behavior." Marcus stood, his suit neatly pressed, his bruised lips still healing. He had rehearsed this, not just the words, but the calm, the posture of a man unjustly accused, too familiar with the system's blind spots to be surprised by another attack. "Those allegations," Marcus said, "come from people loyal to a woman arrested for bribery and civil rights violations. They're trying to erase the truth because it came from me. And you think that justifies your methods?" The second panelist, a gaunt man with a buzz cut, asked. His voice was oily, condescending. "My methods exposed a corrupt judge who twisted justice for decades. You tell me, what's justified?" The third, a heavy-set man with a southern drawl, leaned forward. "You sure this ain't personal? Carver's rulings hurt your community. Maybe this was vengeance, not justice." Marcus's jaw tightened. It was justice because it was personal. "You think racism isn't personal? Try being black in her courtroom." The room went quiet, a long slow pause where none of them could look him in the eye. "We'll issue a ruling in a week," Pritchard finally said. Marcus left the room with his fists clenched. Later that night, he returned to Tanya's motel room. Malik and Isa were asleep, curled up like question marks on the bed. Tanya looked up as he entered. "Well," she asked. "They're dragging it out," he replied, loosening his tie, "which means they're leaning toward suspension." "You're kidding." Marcus shook his head.
I'm not.
"But I've still got moves left." She handed him a mug of instant coffee. "Then play them in the morning." The news wasn't good. Sarah Tillman, the timid former assistant to Judge Carver, who had been cooperating, was suddenly under investigation herself. Anonymous tips claimed she'd tampered with evidence. The feds had sidelined her. "They're gutting the case from within," Lena said over the phone. "One by one. They're trying to make me the villain," Marcus murmured. "And it's working." His name was trending online again, but not in celebration. Headlines blared, "Hero lawyer" or "vigilante." His critics amplified the smear campaign. His allies scrambled to keep the narrative from slipping away. And then came the attack. Marcus didn't see them coming. He was leaving the courthouse parking lot when the van pulled up. 10 men, black masks, baseball bats. The first blow cracked his ribs. The second split his lip again. He fought back, fists flying, but it was a blur of wood and rage, and slurs hurled like knives. They left him bloodied, barely conscious, sprawled on the pavement. The cops came late. Same buzz-cut officer, same shrug, could be random. Marcus didn't bother replying. He just sat on the curb, pain blooming in every nerve, his vision swimming. But he got up. He always did. Back at his apartment, ribs taped, lips stitched, he stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he opened his laptop. There was still one card left to play. He found the old emails from a bank whistleblower, a teller named Clara, who had once flagged strange transactions linked to Carver's real estate donors. He called her. She answered on the second ring. "Miss Clara," he said, voice raw, "I need you to tell the truth." "I kept the records," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to give them to." At midnight, the files hit the press. Clara's records revealed a slush fund linked to Carver, funneled through a hate group called White Dawn. Payments from Rollins, the developer, to accounts used for private security and community operations. It was damning, concrete proof of financial corruption and hate group ties. By sunrise, it was national news. Marcus stood at his apartment window, battered but breathing, watching the city stir beneath the rising sun. Carver wasn't just corrupt, she was the architect of a racist machine, and now the world knew it. But deep in his gut, Marcus also knew something else. She would strike again, and the next blow would aim to finish what the fire started. Marcus Ellison had faced adversity before. As a black attorney in Richmond, Virginia, he'd spent years navigating courtrooms that didn't always welcome him. He'd defended clients falsely accused, challenged biased judges, and taken hits that might have broken lesser men. But nothing prepared him for the moment. 2 uniformed officers stormed into the motel room where he'd been checking on his sister Tanya and her 2 children. Red and blue lights flooded the windows. Sirens howled like wolves in the night. And the lead officer, a white man with a military buzz-cut Marcus, recognized from previous run-ins, shoved a warrant into his chest. "You're under arrest for arson," the cop growled, "for torching your sister's home." Marcus froze, the words not registering at first. Tanya screamed, clutching her children close, as the officers snapped the cuffs on Marcus's wrists. Cold steel bit into his skin, and he stood there, stunned, helpless, to stop what was happening. "This is a mistake," he managed to say. "I didn't do this." But the smirk on the officer's face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't justice. This was retribution. Only hours earlier, Marcus had helped federal agents rearrest Judge Evelyn Carver. He'd uncovered the slush fund that tied her to a hate group. He'd gone public, told his story on the evening news, and watched crowds rally for accountability. For a moment, it seemed like the tide was turning, that maybe, just maybe, His fight was finally bearing fruit. But now, standing in a jail cell with the faint scent of bleach and old sweat in the air, Marcus realized how wrong he'd been. They'd framed him, deliberately, viciously, not just to discredit him, but to destroy him. The fire that nearly killed his sister and her children, that was Carver's doing, her fingerprints all over it, even if the matchbook was held by one of her cronies. And now they were flipping the narrative, turning the crime into Marcus's supposed sin. It was personal now, not just about law, not just about exposing corruption. They were attacking his name, his family, his very identity. He was released on bond the next morning, thanks to a sympathetic federal agent named Torres, who had seen the pattern and knew something was off. "The charges are flimsy," she told him. "They'll collapse once we investigate." But in the meantime, they did damage. And they had. By the time Marcus stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the media had already eaten the story alive. Headlines blared from every corner. Ellison, from hero to arsonist. Talk radio called him unstable. Commentators debated his motives. Some suggested maybe Carver wasn't the villain after all. It cut deeper than any knife. He drove to Tanya's temporary motel room that evening and sat in silence as the kids played Go Fish on the carpet. Tanya's eyes were red from crying. Her voice was soft. "They're saying you did it, Marcus," she whispered. Even people from the old neighborhood. He couldn't speak, couldn't explain how a lie had moved faster than the truth. But the worst moment came, when he walked back to his car, parked behind the motel. Someone had carved the word traitor into the driver's side door. A racial slur followed beneath it, scrawled in red spray paint. The sight of it buckled his knees. He leaned against the hood, the cool metal grounding him, his breath coming in short bursts. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he represented. Carver had weaponized an entire system. Cops, politicians, even local news. They weren't trying to fight fair. They were trying to erase him. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew racism ran deep, but he had believed, perhaps foolishly, that exposing Carver's crimes would shift the ground beneath them. He'd fought with facts, with law, with integrity. But this was something else. This was war. They turned public opinion against him in under 24 hours. Protests once filled with chants of justice for Jamal now had hecklers shouting fraud when his name was mentioned. Donations to his legal fund dried up overnight. His law firm, already struggling from the earlier attacks, lost its last big client that week. And then came the emails, threats, dozens of them, some anonymous, some signed with names he recognized from court cases years back. One simply said, "You should have stayed in your place, boy." Marcus stared at it, jaw clenched, the weight of centuries pressing down on his chest. He couldn't sleep that night. The motel room was too quiet, the silence too loud. He lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. They were trying to erase everything he'd done, not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually. They wanted to strip away his credibility, his dignity, his legacy. But Marcus knew something else, too. You don't go after a man this hard, unless you're scared of him. And they were scared of what he represented, of the change he could bring, of the movement he'd started. So he got up. He brewed a bitter pot of motel coffee, burned his tongue on the first sip, and opened his laptop. He wasn't done. He began documenting everything. Dates, names, emails, photos of the vandalized car, new screenshots. He gathered statements from his sister and neighbors who'd seen shady men lurking near her house before the fire. He built a new case, this time, not for court, but for the court of public opinion. The truth had to catch up. By the end of the week, he went live again on social media, face bruised, voice hoarse, eyes bloodshot. "This is Marcus Ellison,
he said. I was framed for arson. The same people who tried to silence me before. Judge Carver's network, they're still coming for me. They attacked my sister. They blamed me. And now they want you to believe I'm the villain. He paused, then held up a copy of the police report. But the truth leaves footprints, and I'm going to follow every single one until justice walks out into the daylight. The video went viral, not immediately, but by morning it had been shared by major journalists, civil rights groups, and even celebrities. Hashtags swirled. #StandWithMarcus began trending. Protesters returned to the streets, this time louder, sharper, smarter. Federal agents reopened their internal review. Carver's former assistant came forward with new evidence, and the media, sensing a shift in the wind, began walking back their hot takes. Marcus wasn't cleared yet, but the tide was turning again. He knew he might never fully get his name back. Some people would always believe the lie, but he also knew this. If the system could be weaponized against him, it could be exposed too. One fight at a time, he stood at the motel window that night, watching the protest lights flicker in the distance. His sister asleep on the bed, her kids curled up beside her, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a deep breath. They tried to break him, but he was still standing, and he was just getting started.
Marcus Ellison knew that if he didn't take control of the story, the system would write it for him, and in the ugliest ink possible. The smear campaign had nearly destroyed him. His sister's home was reduced to ash. His law license had been temporarily suspended, and the media had turned from calling him a hero to labeling him an arsonist. But Marcus wasn't done. He was bruised, not broken, and more than that, he was angry. Sitting in a borrowed office space above a bakery downtown, he watched as morning light crept across a warped table stacked with old legal files and a beat-up laptop. The walls were thin, the internet was slow, and the place smelled like yeast and burnt coffee. But to Marcus, it felt like a war room. He wasn't just fighting to clear his name now. He was fighting to uncover the entire network of corruption behind Judge Evelyn Carver, the same network that had nearly ended his career and life. He could feel it, like a pressure behind his eyes. Carver's empire wasn't just her alone. It stretched into every corner of Richmond's institutions, law enforcement, real estate, politics, and if he didn't expose them piece by piece, they'd bury him for good. His first move was to reconnect with Vic, a retired detective who still had sources inside the police department. Vic had been quietly helping Marcus since the early days of the Carver investigation, and now Marcus needed his insight more than ever. "You sure you want to go after Tommy Carver?" Vic asked over the phone, his voice raspy from decades of cigarettes. "That boy's no joke. He's Evelyn's nephew, but he's got ties to street crews, runs muscle for hire, out of the East End." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Then that's exactly who I need to find." The name Tommy Carver had come up more than once. Whispers in back rooms, in redacted case files, in the way certain cops glanced away when Marcus asked about the firebombing of his sister's house. Tommy was connected and dangerous. Vic gave him a lead, an old warehouse on 5th Street, where Tommy and his crew were rumored to meet. That night, Marcus didn't call the cops. He didn't even bring anyone with him. He simply parked across the street in his battered Honda, cracked the window, and pulled out his phone. "This is Marcus Ellison," he said into the camera, his voice steady, low. "I've been framed, threatened, nearly killed, but I'm still here, and I'm outside the place where Tommy Carver, Judge Carver's nephew, is running the crew that attacked me and torched my sister's home." He turned the phone slowly, capturing the dim outline of the warehouse, shadows moving inside. "I'm not hiding anymore, and if anything happens to me, this video lives." He ended the live stream and waited. 15 minutes later, police cruisers roared into the parking lot. Marcus didn't move. He watched through his windshield as officers handcuffed Tommy Carver, who emerged from the building red-faced and snarling, his hoodie stained and his hands shaking with rage. Tommy shouted something unintelligible as they shoved him into the back seat, but Marcus had already won that round. The video went viral overnight. Journalists started calling, not just local ones, but reporters from Washington, D.C., and even New York. The story had taken a new shape, not just a crooked judge, but a family-run syndicate of corruption and violence, reaching far beyond the courthouse. Then came the next name, Jack Rollins. Marcus had always suspected the wealthy real estate developer was involved. He'd seen Rollins in too many courtrooms, where Carver had ruled, always walking out with a smirk and a win, even when the facts were stacked against him. Vic confirmed it. Rollins funneled money to Evelyn for years. Vic told him. In exchange, she ruled in his favor in property disputes, foreclosures, evictions, you name it. But suspicion wasn't enough. Marcus needed proof, and that's where Reggie came in. Reggie was a janitor who had cleaned Carver's courthouse for nearly a decade. He knew the nooks, the drawers, the forgotten filing cabinets, where secrets went to die. I saw her take cash from that guy, Reggie whispered, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table at the bakery. Rollins, I thought it was just legal fees or whatever, but then I found this. Marcus unfolded the paper. It was a ledger page, handwritten, dated, and listing initials, Jr. $10,000, April 3rd, Jack Rollins, a bribe, tied to a date where Marcus remembered a black family losing their home, despite airtight evidence of predatory lending. This was the kind of evidence that could bring down a titan. He scanned the page, digitized it, and sent it to Agent Torres at the Justice Department. Then he went live again. Tonight I'm exposing Jack Rollins, he said, holding up the ledger for the camera. A man who used his money to buy justice, to steal homes, to fund hate. He paused, letting the silence sit. This is what Judge Carver was protecting. This is the real reason they're trying to destroy me. The next morning, federal agents raided Rollins' mansion on the outskirts of Richmond. Helicopters circled overhead. Boxes were hauled out. News anchors breathlessly reported the unfolding scandal. The power dynamic was shifting, and Marcus could feel it in every message he received, every interview request, every protest sign that now bore his name. But he wasn't just building a case, he was building a movement. He sat with Lena, his loyal paralegal, and began organizing all the evidence into a public database. Witness statements, video clips, bribe trails, even redacted court transcripts that hinted at larger conspiracies. The site went live under the name truth4richmond.org. Within hours, the traffic crashed the server. You're winning, Lena said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Marcus didn't smile. Not yet, but we're getting there. Rollins tried to deny everything, hired a high-powered PR firm, released a statement accusing Marcus of forgery, lies, and political ambition. But the people weren't buying it anymore. Not after Tommy's arrest, not after Rollins' ledgers, not after watching Marcus get beaten, framed, and still come back swinging. He was turning into a symbol, not just of resistance, but of possibility. 1 week later, CNN ran a feature titled, "The Man Who Took on a Machine." Marcus sat in a folding chair, in front of his burned-down law office, a charred brick behind him, telling the story in his own words. "My name isn't the only thing they tried to destroy," he said, "but I believe in the truth, and the truth has a long tail." By then protests had swelled to nearly 500 people, not just in Richmond, but in D.C., Atlanta, and Chicago. The Justice Department reopened dozens of cases ruled by Judge Carver. Civil suits began stacking against Rollins, and even the Bar Association,
so quick to suspend Marcus before, was now under pressure to apologize and reinstate him fully. That night, Marcus walked alone down Broad Street, the city's main artery. Flyers with his face lined the lampposts. A mural of Jamal Carter, his once falsely accused client, had gone up near a bus stop, with the words "Truth has a name." He exhaled slowly. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice might finally be waking up. And this time, it had Marcus Ellison's voice behind it.
Marcus Ellison sat alone in the dim light of his temporary office above a bakery, his fingers shaking slightly as they hovered over a USB drive. On the screen in front of him glowed the first pieces of irrefutable evidence he had managed to obtain in weeks. The files came from Clara, a brave and frightened bank teller who had reached out in a trembling voice and asked to meet him down by the old pier. Her words echoed in his mind. "Carver's money moves like a ghost, but I've seen its footprints. She's funding something vile." And now, staring at the spreadsheets, wire transfers and cryptic notes, Marcus saw it for himself. Not just bribes, not just corruption, but something far more sinister. The slush fund Judge Evelyn Carver had been funneling money into wasn't just a vehicle to line her own pockets or sway courtroom decisions. It was directly connected to White Dawn, a known white supremacist hate group with ties to firebombings, street violence, and racially motivated intimidation campaigns. Transfers from real estate magnate Jack Rollins, under the guise of consulting fees, had been laundered into shell companies, eventually landing in accounts linked to the organization. Every dollar that moved told a chilling story, and Marcus was about to tell the world. He didn't hesitate. He called Lena, his paralegal, and asked her to double-check the metadata. She confirmed everything matched. Then, without waiting another moment, Marcus opened his phone and went live on X. "This is Marcus Ellison," he said, his voice steady, his wounded shoulder taped under a black hoodie. "You've seen the trials, the threats, the fire. You've heard the lies. Now here's the truth." He held up the USB for the camera. "This drive contains bank records showing that Judge Evelyn Carver, yes, the same woman who's been accused of civil rights violations and corruption, is funding a known white supremacist organization, White Dawn, the same group behind firebombings, threats, and domestic terror." He turned the camera to the laptop screen, scrolling through account numbers, transaction summaries, and handwritten notes bearing Carver's initials, EC. His voice cut through the silence. "This isn't just about bad verdicts. This is about hate, funded by a judge, protected by a network, and it ends today." He ended the stream and immediately emailed the files to Greg, a reporter at the Richmond Times, and Agent Torres, his contact at the Justice Department. What followed was a firestorm. Within an hour, #White Dawn trended nationally. #Carver funds hate became the top topic on X. Major news outlets picked up the story. CNN broadcast the screenshots. MSNBC played segments from Marcus's video. Online forums, lit up with commentary, speculation, and outrage. And on the streets of Richmond, the protests exploded. The crowd doubled by sundown. More than 500 people stood outside the courthouse chanting Marcus's name. Black, white, Latino, young, old. Their signs were fierce. "No judge for hate. Expose the network. We stand with Marcus." Torres called just before midnight. "We're moving," she said, her voice terse but electric. "Rollins is finished. Carver's rearrest is imminent. This is the nail, Marcus." He didn't answer right away. He was standing by his window, watching the gathering crowd below. Someone had lit candles. Another held up a printed photo of Jamal Carter, the young mechanic whose case started this all, with the words "innocence nearly lost." "I want to see it," Marcus said finally.
I want to see them take her in cuffs again. And the next morning, he did. Dressed in plain clothes, Marcus stood across the street from the federal detention center as agents in black suits pulled up in 2 unmarked vehicles. The crowd had followed him. Dozens of protesters stood behind a barricade, their voices echoing across the concrete courtyard. When Judge Evelyn Carver emerged from the building, escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals, her posture was rigid, but her face was pale. Her signature silver bun looked less severe now, slightly frayed. Her hands were cuffed tightly in front of her. She didn't look toward Marcus, but he saw her jaw clench. He saw the fire hadn't died. It had only gone underground. Still, this was a moment he dreamed of. She had smeared him, tried to ruin him, and endangered his family. But now her lies were broadcast on every news feed. Now her network, her funding, her backroom deals, her link to hate groups, was unraveling in real time. But Marcus knew better than to call this justice. This was only the next battle, and the war wasn't over. He turned to the crowd, raised a fist, and for the first time in weeks allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Not triumph, not vengeance, just truth, finally out in the open.
The Richmond sun was just beginning to rise when Marcus Ellison stood across from the detention center, watching Evelyn Carver being led away in handcuffs for the second time. Her silver hair looked less composed now, her posture still defiant, but her eyes no longer burned with power. She looked like what she was exposed, cornered. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to believe it was over. He climbed into his car, closed the door, and rested his head against the steering wheel. The crowd behind him chanted his name. The media swarmed. Jamal was free. Rollins was being dismantled, piece by piece. Carver was in cuffs. The hate group's funding trail had been traced to her private accounts. Victory, until the sharp crack split the air. The driver's side window exploded inward, spraying Marcus with shards of glass. He barely had time to react. His shoulder lit up in white-hot pain as the sniper's bullet grazed him. Blood soaked through his sweater instantly. He ducked, his breath ragged, fumbling for the gear shift. Tires screeched as he sped away from the courthouse, the roar of sirens in the distance, mixing with the high-pitched ringing in his ears. His pulse thundered louder than the engine. He couldn't see the shooter, but he didn't have to guess. This wasn't random. Carver was behind bars, but her reach wasn't. It didn't take long for Agent Torres to confirm what he already suspected. The sniper was tied to Rollins, a former convict turned enforcer, hired muscle, retaliation for leaking the slush fund, for dragging the white supremacist web into the light. "You're lucky to be alive," Torres said grimly over the phone. This was a message. You're still in their crosshairs. Marcus sat in a dark alley, his shoulder crudely wrapped in a bloody rag. His breath was shallow, not from the wound, but from the weight of it all. They had tried to silence him with bricks, with fire, with lies, now with bullets. And yet, he wasn't dead. Not yet. The sniper's shot had missed his heart, but it had hit something deeper. His sense of safety, his illusion that the system was enough. This wasn't just a legal war. This was survival. Carver might be locked up, but the network she'd cultivated was still very much alive, still violent, still venomous. Marcus stared at the blood on his sleeve, then at the city stretching before him. Richmond wasn't safe. Not yet. The system had cracked, but hadn't shattered, and he wasn't done fighting, not until every last piece of her empire was turned to dust. In the story of Marcus Ellison, what begins as a legal battle quickly transforms into a larger fight, a fight not just for justice in the courtroom, but for truth in a world riddled with hidden corruption and unspoken hate. As we follow Marcus through betrayals, violence, and relentless attacks on his character and family, we are reminded of something Every older American knows, deep down, the path to doing what's right is rarely smooth, and sometimes the cost of standing up is steep. But there is a lesson here that speaks to all of us, especially those who have lived long enough to know that life often isn't fair. Marcus teaches us that while evil can disguise itself in robes, in law books, and even in friendships, it cannot hide from the determined light of truth. His journey is a call to conscience, even when power turns against you, even when your name is dragged through the mud. Standing up for what's right matters, especially then. Many of us have witnessed injustice. Some fought for civil rights in the 60s. Others saw communities rise and fall on the tides of political games. We've seen good men silenced, brave women ignored, and institutions meant to serve us become instruments of fear. And yet, like Marcus, we endure. We teach our children and grandchildren not just to dream, but to act with integrity, even when the world tells them to sit down and be quiet. Marcus's story is not just about legal reform or racism, it's about legacy. What do we leave behind when our time is done? Is it comfort bought with silence, or courage built from struggle? His story tells us that truth, though fragile, has a way of surviving. It lives in the hearts of the bold. It passes through generations like torchlight. For older Americans, this is a reminder that your voice still matters. You've seen decades of change. You've watched this country stumble and stand again. And maybe now, more than ever, you have the wisdom to see through the noise, to recognize the battles worth fighting and the people worth believing in. Marcus's fight is far from over, and neither is ours. Justice is not a destination, it's a daily decision.